scholars have tried to come up with different models. So we're going to look at some of them and talk about like, oh, here's the limitation. So one of the first ones that was developed was called the SMCR model. So the S stood for source. And so this was David Berlow in the early 60s. So you had a source, which was the sender. They would send a message. And the message is both verbal and nonverbal. So if your verbal message and your nonverbal message do not match, which do we trust? If one contradicts each other, which one do we trust? The nonverbal, right? The nonverbal. So you say to somebody, what's wrong? And they say nothing. You're like, oh, great, okay. Something's wrong. Those of you who embrace sarcasm, that's hard, right? Because some of you are like, you're supposed to get the nonverbal part, right? So and some of us are like, yeah, but you said the exact opposite thing of what you meant. And you're like, yeah, that's hard, okay? So the source sends a message through a channel. And you can think of a channel as either the medium, was it a text message, was it in person, did you do something on Snapchat, or your census. And that is sent to a receiver, okay? So you have the source who sends a message through a channel to a receiver. And there is something about this that you're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, but I'm not really sure if that's what works in most human communication situations, right? It's not exactly what we're looking for. It's too simplistic, it's too one way. That's not really how communication works. So then there's this guy named Frank Vance who he came up with the helical model. So his metaphor was a helix, and he was like, oh, okay, so communication begins, and then it builds on itself, and it's ever growing. And you can't, whatever happens here, of course, impacts what happens from there on out, right? So it's always growing and building. You're like, that's not a bad metaphor. It's fine, but it too doesn't give us enough of the story. So we finally came up with what is called the transactional model, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we have the communicator. So rather than the sender and the receiver, we have communicators. Because if we're thinking about our interaction, you are communicating with me and I am communicating with you, right? Simultaneously. Even on text messages that could be one way, they're not, right? A lot of you are sending them back and forth, and some of you are impressive. You're having like 12 conversations at the same time, back and forth with different people. It's not like I get a message and I give it back to you. Instead of playing catch, it's kind of happening at the same time, okay? So you have this communicator who's going to send a message to another communicator. In order for that to happen, I would have to encode the message, and they would have to decode the message, okay? So encoding is I have to think, in order to speak, you have to have cognition. I think, okay, what am I trying to say? So let's say, hypothetically, I received a text message from my daughter that said, hey, could you get some milk while you're out? I responded, okay, period, in a text, okay? So I'm encoding, sure, happy to get you some milk. My daughter is going to decode it. What might she decode it as?
Yeah.
You're annoyed.
Oh, God.
You're annoyed?
Oh, God, okay.
Oh, God, okay. Yeah. So that is the encoding and the decoding. So then my daughter will then offer some feedback to me. So she will have to say, okay, what do I want to say to her? And my daughter tends to be like so nice. She's kind of a people pleaser. It worries me because I thought I'd have like little revolutionaries, and she's a little bit on the like too comfortable with authority, like, you know. She's never going to get expelled in her life. Okay, so she encodes, ooh, she doesn't want to do it. So her response to me is, oh, no, don't worry about it. I can pick it up. It's no big deal. I'll get it on my own. And then I then decode that as, oh, shit. It was the period, right? So for a long time, I got in trouble with the ellipses. I like to use those. And it didn't mean anything. It just meant, that's I'm thinking. But apparently, you have different interpretations of it. Right? So this is the sort of process that's happening, but that's not all that is happening. All of this is happening within a channel. The fact that we're text messaging is making a difference, yes? So if I had said O-K-A-Y, would that have made a difference for some of you?
Yes.
Or if I just left the period off? Yeah. Or if I had added an emoji with it, it could have. Right? So the channel makes a difference, because if I said okay in person, that is very different than if it's in a text message. Or if I leave you a Post-it note, I like that. So roommates used to reach a point in the semester where they left each other Post-it notes, and that was a sign like they're never going to live together again, right? They would just leave like a Post-it note on the refrigerator, like, is anyone going to wash the dishes, question mark? But my students told me that people instead send things on Snap now, because then you know Is that true? It's too early. You guys are not having roommate problems yet, right? So you haven't reached the post-it note? Okay, that's good. So the channel makes a difference, right? So if you're texting somebody, that's a pretty lean channel versus if you're having an in-person conversations. Video, right? That's much richer, but not as rich as in person. So it just depends. An email, very different, right? All kinds of, so that impacts the communication of the encoding and decoding, right? We encode and decode differently in an email than we do a text message, don't you think? Okay? So all of this is happening and then something gets in the way and that's called noise. So raise your hand if you're tired. Do you think that's impeding your ability to like this communication event right now? You're like, I'm tired. What about hungry? Raise your hand if you're hungry. Can that get in the way? Some of you can't process. Like you're like, it's 11. I haven't had anything to eat. I can't even talk right now. Like I can't make a decision. This is my brother. He is like out. You might have other worries. Anybody worried about money? The beginning of the year can really do that. Or classes, roommates, maybe your love life. I don't know. Late night. Is it going to happen this week? Should I go? Should I not go? Yeah, so that's noise. So you can have physical noise, like any of you sick, you know, hopefully you're not here if you're too sick. Allergies, absolutely, absolutely. So you can have physical, physiological noise, you can have psychological noise that can get in the way. You can even have semantic noise. Like, are there any words that when people say that word, it like sets you onto the wrong track? Is there any words that people are like, ooh, not that word? Nobody has any words that they're like, I can't?
Expel.
Expel?
Spell.
Spell? You don't like the word spell?
I don't see rhythm to spell.
Rhythm. You don't like the word, I don't like awkward. I think awkward is hard to spell too. A-W. Okay. I should just start saying all the words people hate, like moist, panties. People hate that one too. There's always the list of most hated words, right? For some people, like profanity can be a word that, you know, sort of, yes?
Oh, something came up on your phone and I don't know if it stopped your recording or not. It's like a little message.
It's probably low battery. It doesn't have a lot of battery. Well, I guess that's Okay, so different people have different words. I was talking about how in college I had like an old professor who he probably was not that old, but I was young, so people seem older when you're young. He seemed like he was 100, but he used a lot of profanity. So he loved to like just drop the F-bomb in his experiments, and he had like wild hair. It was like, this is wild. But profanity for me is not a semantic noise, but it might be for some of you when somebody uses profane words or slurs. For sure, is a semantic noise for me. And all of this happens in a context. So it's not in a vacuum. So if you have a conversation in the ladies' restroom that is very different than if you're having that conversation in the hallway, and some of them I think you should not have in the restroom, because then I'm like, this is not, I can't leave the stall, right? It feels like you all are having a moment. What am I supposed to do in this sort of space with this conversation? So if you have a conversation with somebody in their office, that might be different than having the conversation with your faculty member right before class. Some of you are going to give speeches at a time of day that is not convenient, right? Like it's different if you are in a speech class at 8 a.m. that is different than at 2 o'clock, right? Like 2 o'clock class can kind of be wild and not paying attention. They're not tired. They're just sort of done with the day. A 4 o'clock class is impossible, right? Especially on a Friday. We have a 4 o'clock Friday class. Can you imagine how that would change it versus an 8 a.m. class? That's not good either, right? Some of you might be in the perfect spot where you're like, I have an 11 o'clock class. That is the perfect time. This context makes all the difference in the world. Is it 2023? That's different than 2019 because the pandemic changed public speaking in so many different ways, and you're different because of it. So communication has all of these elements. So it's not so simplistic, right? This idea that you have a communicator who encodes a message and thinks about both the verbal and the nonverbal parts of the message to another communicator who decodes it, then encodes their message, offers feedback that then you decode. All of that happens with specific channels, and then there's this noise happening, and we have to think about the context. So the likelihood that you will give exactly what you want to your audience and that they will get it is very, very low. There's all of these variables that are happening at play. right? So the perfect hand gesture is not going to make or break the speech. There's a lot of other variables. So then we try to break down through these big ideas how to make sure that what you are trying to communicate, what you have encoded, that they will decode it appropriately and accurately. And that's hard to do because there's all these variables. So it's not as simplistic as a lot of us think. And it also is impacted by the levels of communication, right? Like what are the different kinds of communication that exist?